Okay, we're wrapping things up here. We got chapter 18 today. So I'm wearing one of my very special ties. This one actually looks like an ear of corn. Um, always good to celebrate with little meaningless things like that. um, so we're talking about the end of life here. Not necessarily death, but kind of the social parts uh, kind of wrapping up the life in the last stages that we have. Now with Erikson, and we get to talk about boy type Erikson here. We'll get into girl type Erikson in just a second. Um, we have ego integrity versus despair. Now this is his last stage. Now keep in mind, Erikson isn't really talking about late adulthood. Erikson is talking about you being about to die, really seeing that mortality. So that might not really happen at around the age of 60. Until you start, retiring, start doing less with your life, that's when you're going to really start getting into this ego integrity versus despair. Now, the reason he gets into this is because this is a time of reflection. Um, you reflect on whether or not you have wasted your life, how many regrets you have. Emotionally, this is a huge part of the development, kind of reflecting on all the mistakes that you've made, and either you're cool with them and you can deal with that, or you're not and you're going to despair. You're going to, think that you've wasted your life. Now, Erikson's wife, Joan, actually proposed another stage after Erikson died. She kind of reflected on things herself, and she proposed a gerotranscendence. And this is where it's kind of like the very opposite of the part you get over when you're around the age of 5, where children are very self-centered. Everything is based around the self. They really can't put themselves outside of themselves. Well, gerotranscendence is a stage where or kind of a mentality where it's almost impossible to think within yourself. You're very much moving beyond yourself. Some people might think of this as enlightenment of a sort. You're just very other centered during this stage in your life, which is kind of an interesting way to think of it. It's a little bit more cognitive than social, but interesting nonetheless. Now, um, during this stage socially, you have a very secure sense of self concept. Now, what that means is that if you are not in this stage, you are less secure in your sense of self. And you don't think of it like that, but you are. And the reason for this is because you probably feel threatened by people. When you're very secure in your sense of self concept, you're not threatened by people anymore. Other people can disagree with you all day, every day. It doesn't bother you. It does not threaten your sense of self. If And there's a lot of ways that you see this manifest. We spoke of religion a lot in the last couple of classes, so I'll go over it here. One of the kind of hallmarks of insecure religious faiths are whether or not people are threatened by other people's lack of religion or disagreeing with them in one sort or another. And you can see the same thing with politics. You'll talk to somebody that believes in something. It doesn't matter whether it's political or religious, and they might think that it's fine if you disagree with them. It might not bother them in any way whatsoever. They might have absolutely no goal to convert you to their either religious or political beliefs, but somebody else with the same belief system will feel very threatened by the fact that you disagree with them either religiously or politically. And that threat, they don't usually acknowledge it themselves, but it will manifest itself as them wanting to convert you. They want to argue with you, not just to explain their position, but to try to get you to agree with them. And it's that lack of tolerance of other people agreeing with you that kind of goes away um, during this time because they're so secure in their sense of self-concept. Um, Now, speaking of religion, we get into this a little bit more because older adults get religious. Now, why do they get religious? It could be a sense of mortality. They don't really go into this too much in the book. A lot of people feel that one thing I'll preface this with, this with is that the sense of religion that people have for this time of their life is very cultural. We like to think that older people have a tendency to get religious, but that's only in this one culture. In other cultures, they don't get religious. As a matter of fact, in England, older adults get less religious, not more religious. And that's the trend in a lot of other parts of the world. It doesn't happen to be that way in America. We have a tendency to get more religious. So why is it? Uh, Perhaps it's a sense of mortality. The religion that we have a tendency to follow in this culture is based around rewards in the afterlife. So maybe it's a sense of mortality that does this. Maybe it's the fact they have nothing better to do. They're going to want to go to church because, nobody else is talking to them. They generally lead a very lonely life, especially if they're widowed. And that's going to, obviously have a big impact at this point because if you're married, your partner can die. It could just be the fact that they have hope. They're not necessarily doing anything else, so they want to stay hopeful. Honestly, it might boil down to the fact that people have different reasons for belonging to religions, and this is something that's very difficult to analyze because religion is basically filled with, psychologically speaking, crap. Okay, we lie to ourselves about religion all the time. When we actually look at what we're getting out of religion, it's very difficult to really assess those emotional needs because religion is so quagmired in what you're supposed to feel that it's hard to actually figure out what you actually are feeling. And I'm not disparaging a spiritual relationship that you have with whatever in any way whatsoever. I'm just saying it's very difficult to be really self-aware when it comes to why you feel ways you do and what you're really getting out of it. And clearly religion fills some vast psychological needs. Even in this country, here in the States, those that really get more religious as they get older are generally low SES. People of high SES, people of means, they generally get less religious. So that just kind of goes to show that, the religion is probably fulfilling different emotional needs. And for people that have means, people that have money, they're probably getting those emotional needs filled elsewhere. So they just don't need the religion as much. Now, on page 482, goes over a lot of different theories of different social change in late adulthood. I'm not going to go over it. There's like 5 or 6 different theories. They're very well said. Go ahead and know those. Another thing you want to keep in mind, a lot of little factoids here in this. I find this chapter a little bit more interesting than some of the others, just because this is kind of an overlooked period in people's lives. We ignore this. We think it's the end when it's a time of such rapid change. We like to think of people in their old age being in nursing homes. 5% of people in this phase are in nursing homes. They're basically the worst off of all of us. People that can't live on their own, and these are the exceptions. So don't think that 95% of the rest of the world the rest of their cohort is not in a nursing home. So the nursing home people are not the average. On page 487, skipping ahead a couple of pages here to something a little bit more interesting, they go over several reasons why married people are much happier in life than single people this age. They go over, I think, 5 reasons why this is. I want to go over the last one. And one of the reasons they're happier is because people who are married in late adulthood are very happy with their relationships, typically speaking. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but one of them is that they get appreciated more. Now, marriages are kind of rife with a lack of appreciation. No matter what role you fill, it seems that your partner doesn't really appreciate what you're doing. But at this time in your life, you're more appreciated. Again, this is a time when your partner isn't threatening you with whatever disagreements you happen to have, so you're going to be a lot more laid back. And the fact is, you appreciate what you get from your partner. First of all, what they bring to the table, the resources. And this isn't the same things that you value. You actually value more of their resources at this age. Just the fact they have different social circles. You get to spend more time with them. Maybe they have different family. They die, you're not going to get to hang out with their family anymore. And it's these social connections that you value so much. Just the company that you keep is going to be appreciated a lot more. So you're going to be appreciated a lot more in these relationships. And in turn, when you have a relationship, whether they're friendships or whatever, you're going to appreciate the people that much more. So a lot of times the relationships are much closer and much more valued than any relationship you've had previously in your life. Obviously, I can't speak from experience. I'm not that old yet. The book goes over several people who, and this is kind of the last thing I'll go over, although it might take a little bit of time, who were never married or had children. And they have a couple of pages on this, and it's interesting, and I definitely urge you to read it. But what they miss is the trend of people who never have children, but they're married. And I'm not sure why they missed this. I went ahead and I dug up a fascinating article that was written a few years ago about this recent trend of people who are just throughout their life during the entirety of development not having children. And this is something that we kind of get the belief that this is a very recent trend. As a matter of fact, they found that in the year 2000, 20% of 50-year-old women were childless. Now they're testing 50-year-old women because this is the point in their life where if they haven't had children, they're not going to anymore. So these are people who have made a lifetime decision of not having children. And so 20% by 2000. And in 1980, there was only 10% of 50-year-old women who were childless. So we can see that in our current society as being a current trend. But the fact of the matter is this time of 20% has kind of waxed and waned throughout history. It was at almost 30% in the 40s. About 20 years earlier, it was around 20% again. And then it dips down and goes up. So we don't really have a recent trend. We're just on kind of an upsurge right now, and it's kind of a constant cycle, historically speaking, which is kind of interesting. So what I want to talk about is this idea of being married but not having children. So it's a lot different from what they're talking about in the book. So these are people who are purposefully not having children. Now, historically speaking, we've looked at this in a different perspective throughout the history of psychology. It started actually with looking at the choice to not have children as only being very egocentric and a very selfish decision. It was a very childish decision to think only of yourself and never want to grow up. And up until the 1950s, this is really how we examined this and the sorts of questions that we asked. Now, in the 60s, they changed because it was starting an upward trend again. And so they worried that this trend of people not having children and choosing not to have children would affect the country. And so pretty much for the entire 60s, that's how they looked at it. You know, would we have underpopulation? Would we have, maybe there were only certain types of people who are not having children? It's been shown that people of low SES have a tendency to have a lot of children, and very educated people don't have many children at all. So, they were asking questions like, is this going to leave it so that basically the idiots of the world breed and the really smart people who we want to be parents aren't? And by the 70s and 80s, being childless was considered an alternative lifestyle. And it's interesting because I'm not really sure from a historical perspective which attitude was right. Probably somewhere in the middle, just like everything else. But just looking at it as an alternative lifestyle is ignoring the fact that it can be an alternative lifestyle based on selfishness. We try so hard to be accepting that we're neglecting the fact that those original studies, as biased as they may be, had the intent of determining the reason people were making the choices. And now we're just looking at them as a choice to make, while completely neglecting the fact that there's a reason for these. Maybe it is selfish. Maybe it's based on something else. Maybe it's based on not selfishness, but thinking very poorly of yourself. Maybe thinking that you don't have the right to be a parent because you're hardly equipped to be an adult, let alone a parent to raise other adults. So there could be a lot of these motivations, and it hasn't really been studied because we're so into being accepting that we don't want to judge people, and honestly, that just kind of sucks. Now, early biological theories thought that childless people were simply not of good stock. essentially it was kind of a self-selected eugenic theory where um, we can't consciously tell whether or not we should breed, but people that were childless were people who kind of genetically were predisposed to understand that they were not of good stock, and so this would manifest as just not having the desire to breed. Um, this theory has pretty much gone by the wayside at this point. While there are some biological theories that have a lot of say in it, there's a lot of really good stock, good intellectual stock, that nowadays, because of the social structures that we're going to talk about in a little bit, are choosing not to have children. Um, White people, far more likely to choose not to have children. Atheists, far more likely to choose not to have children. It seems a common trend. So clearly, we're talking about social and cognitive things because it's the societies we're talking about here. You know, white people are not physiologically any different from, say, Hispanics. You can make an argument that we're physiologically different from black people, but you can't make an argument that white people are physiologically different from Hispanics because Hispanics are white people. They're genetically speaking, they're almost identical. Um, I mean, white people in America are just basically mutts. We're a mix of European and Russian and German and French and Austrian and all these various people. And then, of course, we mixed with some of the Native Americans over here. And but you could say the exact same thing for Hispanics. Where genetically speaking, they're a mix of a bunch of different European countries, except one of them was Spain. And as soon as one of them was Spain, and then they had a little bit more of the indigenous Native American blood than a lot of the whites did. Um, but it's like the only thing unifying them genetically is the fact that they happen to have some Spanish culture somewhere in their past. Other than that, they're Americans just like white people. So genetically speaking, you can't really make an argument for a lot of differences. Um, so it has to be some social differences, which is why they're making these other changes. There's one theory called a relational choice theory. Now, we talked about social exchange theory, where you are willing to give up some things in order to get others. Relational choice theory is very similar to social exchange, where this is where a lot of people have a tendency to look at children as having costs and benefits, as having a lot of your choices of having costs and benefits. And honestly, if you look at having children just as a relational choice in kind of weighing the pros and the cons, you're often going to choose not to have them because relational choice theories, they differ from social exchange theories in the fact that social exchange theories take subjective measurements into consideration. They take feelings into consideration, and having children is a very social, emotional uh, choice to make. And relational choice doesn't look at it as an emotional choice. It just thinks, okay, you know, this is the resources they'll take, this is the resources they'll give me. People that look at it like this have a tendency to think of having children as, you know, when I get old, are they going to take care of me? Am I going to need the resources then? Am I going to need the social support? They're not looking at this subjectively, so they're often going to choose not to have children. Um, Almost looking at like having children as a business deal, which admittedly worked really well in very agrarian societies and like farmer societies. And this may be why we have the biological predisposition to look at having children as a business deal. You know, the more hands you had on the farm, if you had tons of um, tons of daughters, you could basically sell them off, and they could take care of your children, and then they'd just leave anyway and get married. And if you had tons of sons, it'd help on the farm. So there's really no downside to that. But it was kind of thinking of it like a business. Now, other theories are more social. They say that we have children because of cultural norms, and this is really interesting, getting into the cultural norm aspect of it, because um, the idea is we have less gender roles now, less forced behaviors and more accepted behaviors. We're much more accepting society now, and so cultural norms are giving the way of well, there aren't that many norms. You have to choose your own path, and this is going to lead people to not choosing not to have children, where with cultural norms they would have children. Now, this is a very misunderstood theory, the cultural norm theory, and the reason for that is we like to think of this as, well, now that we don't have, we like to glorify the crap that we have a tendency to do. We like to think that, well, now that we're not forcing people into choosing cultural norms, they're choosing their own path. They're more free, which is crap. They're less free now, because the fact of the matter is we rely on cultural norms for so many of our decisions. And now that we don't have cultural norms, some people are just choosing not to make any decisions. It isn't that these people are now more free to do what they want to do. It's that these people are just as confined to social norms as anybody else. But now that there aren't social norms, now that there aren't gender stereotypes, they're just directionless. They have no motivation to do anything. They don't see the thrill in having children because they're not really driven to do anything else either. Um, as a matter of fact, often these people have a tendency to latch on to whatever social norms they can possibly get. So they have a tendency to be very career driven because that's the social norm they're gonna cling on to. So we have all these different really fascinating reasons why people might choose to be childless. So now in old age, people really fear being childless and the drawbacks of it. But remember, this is a kind of an not opportunistic, optimistic time when people are really seeing the best in life. They've usually licked Erickson's theory of ego integrity. They're happy with themselves. They see any regrets that they made as well, that's just the life path that I took, and they're very accepting of themselves and who they are. So while we look at people who are childless and we feel bad for them, like, well, I bet they really have a lot of regrets in life. The fact is, it doesn't really affect their overall happiness because they're going to adapt to whatever stupid decisions they made in life. They could literally have been a crack junkie most of their life, and now they can't afford crack anymore. They're on the wagon, and they're like, you know what? That's just who I was. I was keeping it real. They'll come up with whatever stupid little decision keeps them happy. And the people who are childless do the exact same thing. Um, there are a couple of drawbacks. Uh, there are some social drawbacks when you look at them objectively. Again, subjectively, people are generally happy with their old age, but objectively, they don't have as many social resources. They don't have big families. You know, a lot of the people they're social with or have connections with have died. You know, having a big network does make a big difference. They're, of course, economically better taken care of. And they do have a tendency to be a little bit more responsible if they've already had children. Um, and more importantly, men. If a man has been childless his whole life, there's a lot of social drawbacks. These are people who have a tendency to be much more shy. They're physically withdrawn. They have far less social networks, and they've never really learned connection. There's really a fascinating part when you're in early adulthood where you're learning to have a family, and it teaches men a lot. It really does. Because, you know, men aren't taught in our culture to be all that emotional, to be social, and we have a hard time with it. So these are people who've never learned, and so they have a tendency to be a lot more withdrawn. But other than that, it doesn't really affect your happiness and whether you're the overall satisfaction you have with your life, because generally you're going to be satisfied almost no matter what steaming pile of crap your life poured on. And that's actually a trend that you can look back and think about all the stages of life. You're going to have your happiness doesn't seem to be determined on how well you're doing. When you're an adolescent, you're so miserable and life is horrible and you have no problems. You can have children that actually have problems. Maybe they have physically abusive parents, or they're very poor, they don't have any real resources, and they whine and moan and complain, but no more than the spoiled rich little girl that is sad that her her daddy bought her a brown pony instead of a white one. Um, and so they're just miserable their whole lives, and during emerging adolescence they were feeling that they're totally unequipped for adulthood, whether they are or not. Of course they're equipped for adulthood. First of all, adulthood isn't that hard. Just shut up, do what you're told, and stop worrying about it so damn much is pretty much the rule of life. You can float through on that until you have a plan. And now, when you get to the later part of adulthood, people are generally happy no matter what they do, because again, that's just the cognitive development that we have and the social development that we have. So that's it for life. Good luck on the test.